get on to our next panel. So really appreciate you sharing some of that information with us, Jordan.
Of course, thanks so much.
All right, so we're gonna stop this. If you stop sharing, Jordan, I'll pull up the next group. And what we're going to go to next is a panel covering some of the aspects of incentive systems that are available for cover crops from different sources. We have with us representatives of 3 different agencies. So the first will be Jim Plassmeyer with the Department of Natural Resources. For those of you that aren't from Missouri, Missouri has a relatively unique program where we have sales tax that contributes to a soil and water program, and Jim will tell you some details of that. So Jim, you can go ahead and unmute yourself, and I've got to maneuver between a couple screens to get the slides up here, but I'll have it up in a minute.
Can you hear me all right, Rob?
Yes.
Okay, good. So while you're pulling up my presentation, I'll kind of give a little intro background. As Rob said, I'm Jim Plassmeyer with the Soil and Water Conservation Program within the Department of Natural Resources. One of the things with the Soil and Water Conservation Program, we have the Park Soils and Sales tax that generates the funding for our cost share program. So I'm going to give just an overview of the cover crop program that we have available today, and kind of go through what our policies are, how we got started with the cover crops and things like that. So
Jim, you can just tell me to advance the slide, and we'll have this QR code for this session again at the end of the session if people don't want to grab it now.
Okay,
right.
So if you want to go ahead, Rob, go ahead to the next slide. So a little bit of timeline. So we have a state commission. It's a 6-farmer member commission that establishes our policies for the state, for our cover crop, or for our cost share practice, and any of them that we do throughout the state. We initiated the cover crop program back in 2012, so it is a relatively new program that we have available for cost share assistance. The Sheridan County SWCD had approached the commission about looking at cover crops and offering it as a practice in the state. They also set up a demonstration farm there in Sheridan County that they were doing some research with MU and different things throughout the years there as well too. So we started that program, and in 2014, the commission did a statewide pilot, and then effective in 2015 is whenever we formalized our policies, but yet they've been changing as we've been working through them since 2016. So like I said, relatively new practice. If you go on to our next slide, we do have the policies, and this is how our policies are structured today for the practices that we do have available through the local soil and water districts. We do have a minimum requirement of 2 crop rotation, and we're looking at that as far as we're wanting to work on something besides just a monoculture. It goes back to the soil health benefits as far as the more diversification we have there in the farm, and that's what we're trying to accomplish with this cover crop practice. Production crop is no-tilled into the cover crop. Again, minimizing the tillage that we have and improving the soil health is what we were trying to accomplish with that. We do allow grazing. There's a lot of benefits. We heard yesterday from the producers talking about how they've incorporated grazing into their cover crops and the benefits that they see from the soil health. So that's part of the reason why we do allow the grazing part of it. We just heard from Dr. Wade as far as the Soil Health Center and sampling that happens there. We do require soil samples to be submitted to SHAC to get the assessment of what's happening on the producer's property. We follow NRCS's guidance as far as the seeding dates and such as that. They do have certain, depending on the species that are going to be planted, some time recommendations of when to plant or when not to plant is some of the things that we follow there. We do allow spring plantings, but we do ask that they be planted at least 60 days prior to termination. And the reason for that is to make sure we have growth, we get benefits from the cover crops prior to the crop being planted in the spring. Now, I did mention earlier about no-tilling. We have made some modifications to our practices when it comes to some tillage. We realize in the fall that there are times whenever there could be ruts from harvesting and stuff like that. So we have allowed tillage on 25% of the fields to help smooth the ruts from the harvest equipment. And that kind of follows the no-till standard that NRCS has, is where we developed that criteria from. As we've been developing these practices, we've been hearing a lot of comments as far as getting the cover crops established. In the fall time of the year, when producers are trying to get over hundreds, maybe even thousands of acres, the most rapid process to get the cover crops seed on the ground is broadcasting. And so we've heard some concerns of ones that do broadcast it, that they would like to do some type of incorporation of the seed to help with a better stand or a better emergence of the cover crop. So, excuse me, we have modified our practice policies that we do allow minimum soil disturbance for that incorporation of the seed, but it has to be with equipment that would have a stir value of less than 20. So you're like, okay, so how do I come up with that stir value of less than 20? And that's where the local soil and water district would come in, that they would run the Russell 2 calculations to determine what equipment you're running, how often are you running it across the field, and looking at your cropping rotations is how they determine that stir value. Next slide, Rob. The other thing that we do require is 25% of the mix must be a grass species, whether it's a cool season grass or a warm season, summer annual, something to that effect. We built that into our policies because of the erosion factors that we're wanting to make sure we're capturing and having as much erosion benefits as we can. So we felt like with a 25% mix of grass, we would have those benefits along with the other soil health benefits as well. The mechanical harvesting, so that would be no hay, no seed, grain harvest, anything like that. Again, we want to leave the materials on the field so that we're not removing the nutrients, we're not removing the biomass and things like that. Our payment process, we try to keep it within the same fiscal year. So we do require either the production crop has already been planted into the cover crop, or if we're at May 25th or later, we will go ahead and make the payment with the stipulation that the landowner has to no-till that production crop into it, even though they haven't done it yet. Again, it goes back to the timing of the crop and weather and stuff like that. And then the other thing we've talked about is we do not allow it, or we do not provide cost share assistance if it's on pasture or hayland, just because we do have other practices that provide some interseeding of legumes and stuff like that to help diversify the pasture and hayland fields. As far as our incentive payments, we have two different rates that we pay on. If you're doing a 1 or 2 species mix, it is $30 per acre. That's 100% $30. Or if it's 3 or more, it is $40 per acre. And then, like I mentioned, we do require a soil sample to be submitted to SHAC. It is $90 per acre. We pay $90 per sample. We do pay 75% of that sample, so the producer gets $67.50. We also have in the policies as far as doing a follow-up sample, and that follow-up sample would be after the cover crops have been in the same field for 4 to 5 growing seasons in a row. And we were looking at doing that follow-up sample to see, try to get some measurements of improvements that we're seeing throughout that field due to the cover crops. And so we would cost share on that as well too. And then we also do have a lifetime limit of $20,000 per operator as we're working through this cover crop program. Next slide. Jordan kind of touched on some of this. These are just the 11 samples analysis that are done at SHAC whenever the soil sample is submitted to them. Like I said, I'm not going to touch on them, but just want to kind of say what we do provide the sampling is analysis of what is done. Our next slide talks about the report that the producers will receive back from those analysis. It is a comparison of the producer soils to the other soils samples throughout the county and the state. And then also there are some recommendations for each of the analysis, some of the stuff that Jordan was talking on just a little bit as well too. But again, just trying to show producers how they can make improvements to their soil health based off of those 11 analyses that are completed. just the practice utilization, kind of show how our practice cover crops have expanded since we started. Like I said, in 2015 was a pilot year. We did have more acre limits and $1 per producer limit. So we did have minimal usage that year, but you can see since then it has grown. We're in 2019, we had a bigger year. And if everybody remember, that was the summer of 2018 when we had a drought. That year we did lift our policies about haying the cover crops due to the shortage of forages in the state. So I think that was why we had such a big ramp up of our cover crops in 2019. But again, you can see the cost share dollars that we spent out plus the acres that we are addressing each year through our cost share assistance. And so with that just kind of gives you a quick wrap up of our cover crop program. The website there on the page that you see now is our site. You can contact your local soil and water conservation district to sign up for the cost share assistance. You can find their contact information on that website as well too, and any other of our cost share practices that we have available.
Thanks very much, Jim. And what we're going to do with this panel is just go through the other two speakers, and then we'll have some time at the end for questions from all three panelists about the three different programs. I do want to mention, unlike maybe a smaller Zoom meeting where you can do that raise hand function, we're not really able to utilize that with the Zoom webinar, partly due to the number of people on, and also the fact that the Zoom webinar mutes anyone who is not a panelist. So our only option for you to ask questions is through the Q&A function. So please use that for your questions, and you can be typing those in at any time. All right, we're going to switch next to the Missouri Department of Conservation Programs, and we have Lisa Potter on to visit with us about that. So let me advance to the next slide here, and Lisa, you can take it away.
All right, well, thank you so much. First, want to say thanks for inviting me to speak and share some information about some of our state cost share programs that can provide financial assistance. I did want to mention, I was able to catch the 11 o'clock session yesterday where they were talking about grazing cover crops. And I came out of that presentation inspired. I was inspired not only by the three gentlemen who spoke in that session, the innovation that they were showing on their farms, both on the production side and the conservation side. But I was inspired because the pictures that they were showing were just such great examples about or showing great examples of how agriculture and wildlife habitat can be compatible. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. I kept thinking when they were showing the pictures of their farms of I would love to walk around and just look around their farm, because even though wildlife was probably not their primary objective for their farms, seeing those pictures, I could imagine just all the grassland birds and other wildlife that were loving the types of habitat and grasses and diversity that they were creating on their farms. So kind of along those lines, I think that leads really well into the topics that I'm going to cover here, and you can advance the next slide. So I'm going to talk about two programs that can provide financial assistance to help farmers and landowners apply some of the practices that, if you made that 11 o'clock session yesterday, that you were seeing on their farms. And it can be risky and maybe scary to try something new. So all these cost share programs that we're talking about, whether that's Jim with Soil and Water or Susan with NRCS here in a bit, or the MDC programs, this financial assistance will hopefully help reduce some of that financial risk for folks that want to try something new on their farms. So the first program I'm going to talk about is the MDC State Cost Share Program. We call it the Landowner and Community Assistance Program, or LCAP for short. And we have many practices available through our LCAP program. Roughly, we're averaging about $1.8 million available through this program, and those funds go directly to private landowners who are implementing practices through this program. We have anything from, kind of our bread and butter, if you will, with establishing, native grasses and forbs or timber management. But we also have practices in there that are compatible with ag, such as alternate watering systems or fencing, or cover crops, as like I'm going to talk about here. So even though we have many practices available through LCAP, I'm only going to, of course, focus on the ones that are designed to assist with cover crops. And then the second practice I'll talk about, it's actually a partnership that MDC has had for several years with the Missouri Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts, and really is I guess an easy way to sum it is additional incentives on top of the soil and water conservation practice cost share, what Jim just talked about. So you go ahead and advance the next slide. So the first practice that I want to talk about is how we are offering incentives to basically use cover crops almost as a site prep for establishing native warm season grasses. So one of the challenges we often hear for those producers that are interested in converting some of their operation from, say, the fescue pasture into the native warm seasons is loss of forage during that establishment period. So not only does this practice provide site prep if you need it, for instance, if you're converting your a fescue field that's been in fescue for 20 years, but it also provides some forage for your livestock while you're trying to establish that native warm season component in your operation. And again, back to that compatible tie between wildlife and production and farming, it's also going to provide wildlife habitat. Not only the cover crops is the benefits that cover crops bring to wildlife and pollinators, like you heard Director Pauly talk about earlier, but it provides food sources and pollinator and potential nesting. So it's also going to provide the wildlife habitat from the cover crops as well as the natives that you're establishing in this process. Go ahead and advance. So really grazing is part of this process. The techniques that I'm going to go over really don't work without the cows. Cattle are a great way to manage existing native warm season stands of grass. And now we're finding that they're a great way to help establish as well. So through this program, our payment is $15 per acre per year. And it's kind of a two-year process. And you're also able to get an additional $30 per acre basically to help with the potential loss of forage while you're going through this in terms of full production forage. Go ahead and, oh, there we go, thank you. So like I was saying, it's a 2-year process, and the first year, we're only talking about planting cover crops alone. So this first year planting is not always necessary. For instance, if you were going to, establish an old crop field into native warm season grasses, you probably don't need that first year of cover crops only. But if you were trying to convert a field that's been in fescue for 20 years, we really recommend that you are going to use that first year of cover crops only. And you can go ahead and push the button again. I think I have one more bullet there. And so that's an example of a field, that picture that you're seeing right there, of where we have applied this practice. And that is a multi-species cover crop mix that we were using to help convert that fescue field. And that's a picture in August. So you can see that it's very lush and both wildlife friendly and good forage. They put cows in there in August as well. So here's an example of some of the cover crop species that we recommend. For that year one, if you're going into fescue, we're going to recommend you spray that cool season grass in early spring, and then drill a cover crop mix, minimum of 6 species, because we're wanting to get that diversity out there. Sometime between April and June. I believe in the example I'll be talking about here, they planted theirs in May, and that was that August picture that I just showed you. Go ahead and click. And again, grazing is allowed that first year. We want you to get out there and graze that, not only to help with the additional forage source, but also to get some some structural diversity in that cover crop planting. So we do ask that a residual plant height, you're keeping that to about 8 to 10 inches, and that the cattle are removed by September 1, so we can have some overwintering cover as well. And then if you're still having issues with cool season, that fescue coming back, then we'd recommend you spray it again in fall. Go ahead and next slide. So for that second year, this was a pilot for several years, starting back in 2014, and we've seen great success. So that second year, what we're asking folks to do is both plant cover crops and that native warm season mix at the same time. So essentially what they're doing is in one direction, they go in and they plant the cover crops. And then in the opposite direction, so we're making sure we're avoiding compaction, they're going in and they're planting that native warm season grass. And so again, we're asking for a minimum of 4 cover crop species to get that diversity out there. Go ahead and click. And we're asking to put the cows out there. And this is really important because we need the cows out there grazing those cover crops to make sure there's going to be enough sunlight to allow the seedlings of the native warm season grasses to come up. So in our examples, we typically recommend the landowner start grazing the cover crops once they reach about 24 inches. Go ahead. And then again, we still want to maintain, at least 10 inches of residual cover crop plants, because if they graze it too much, then they'll start finding all those yummy seedlings of the native warm season grass. So it is kind of a fine line of making sure that there's enough light to get down to those seedlings, but at the same time, we don't want to overgraze where they're not eating the cover crops, rather they're eating those native warm season grass seedlings come up. So again, the trial that I keep referring back to, they planted it in May, they started grazing in August. The way that they managed the planting or the grazing, it was a pretty intensive system. So this might not, be a great practice or a suitable practice for everybody, because you need to be available and have time to move your cows. So they use the strip grazing approach, and roughly, don't necessarily want to read the slide to you, but they had quite a few cattle on there, and they moved them each night and grazed them for about 30 days and had an approximate average daily gain of 2 pounds. So this practice was really helping some of the folks get through that summer lull. And then even at the end of the first grazing, or the first growing season, so that first year of planting the native warm seasons, there were plenty of the big blue stem and little blue stem and Indian grass and switchgrass that was coming up that first year. Go ahead, next slide. So that's a quick rundown of how we use cover crops in our landowner assistance and our LCAP program. So the next one I'm going to touch on is the partnership program that I referenced earlier, partnership with Missouri Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts. And like I said, this program provides additional incentives on top of whatever cost share that is available through the Soil and Water Conservation Program. MDC is throwing a bit of an additional incentive on there to promote, to encourage the use of multi-species cover crops, as well as those wildlife-friendly cover crop species. Go ahead, next slide. And this is a busy slide. I don't expect you to read it, but like our LCAP, there's lots of other opportunities through this partnership program. So for instance, and it's all based on the Soil and Water Conservation Program, so it follows their policies. But this again is we have practices where if a landowner would like to use multi-species native grasses, then MDC can throw an additional incentive to help with establishing buffers, and when they're excluding, say, forest land, we can assist with that. But I'm going to focus on that last practice with the red arrow for the cover crop enhancements. Next slide. So again, what we're trying to do is just get examples out there, not only for the soil health and water quality benefits that cover crops bring, but the potential wildlife value. That's a picture there of a high diversity summer cover crop mix. You can imagine that's going to attract a lot of grassland birds, quail included. Again, we're providing a $15 per acre incentive. So that's on top of that $30 to $40 you'll potentially receive from the Soil and Water Conservation Program. And our funds only go so far. So we do have a 100-acre maximum per participant. Next slide. So we do have some recommended cover crop species that are particularly wildlife friendly. You can see there's winter termination and spring termination mixed there. And it really all ties back to both the soil and water policies and the NRCS policies. So what we're asking for, they've got a implementation requirement sheet. That's what that IR 340 is. And as long as the cover crop species is listed good, very good, or excellent for wildlife or pollinators, then that's eligible to be used through this incentive. A point that I want to make that is a little bit different than the soil and water program policies is that for the MDC incentive, we're not allowing the spring plantings. And that's basically because of that policy note that Jim talked about, where they require at least 60 days between planting and termination for the cover crops. And because we don't want to accidentally create a nesting sink, if you will, where basically we're attracting grassland birds to nest in these cover crops only to be terminated, those nests be terminated when that cover crop is terminated. We ask that the cover crops are terminated by May 1, and with that 60-day requirement within that soil and water policies, there's just not enough time between planting and termination to get that growth. Next slide. And that was really quick explanation of those two available practices. If you are interested in either of those practices or other practices within the MDC cost share program, I encourage you to go to the MDC website. And in the top corner of that website, you're going to see a contact and engage button. It's kind of a couple steps you got to do, but there's a screenshot of where that takes you. You can click on local MDC contacts and basically sort by county to figure out who you can contact to learn more about these programs. We have private land conservationists across the state, roughly one PLC or private land conservationist per 2 counties. So there's a lot of staff out there that are there to assist you, answer your questions, and help you reach your objectives for your lands. And then I also put in a link to find the contacts for your local soil and water conservation district offices to learn more about the soil and water program. And with that, I will turn it back.
Well, thank you, Lisa, very much for that excellent overview. And I know we've got folks outside Missouri, but I hope you're getting ideas for programs you might encourage your state agencies to do, or just look and see what they currently have available. Because I know the programs do vary from state to state. Now, one program that is consistent in most ways across states is our NRCS programs that are available. So our third and final panelist is going to touch on that topic, and that's Susan Mammen from Missouri NRCS. And I know from my own experience that there are some small differences between the ways that programs like EQIP and CSP are implemented, including individual payment rates, but a lot of the guidelines are similar. So Susan, take it away. And if you're outside Missouri, just keep in mind you have similar opportunities in your state through NRCS. Okay, Susan, you should be live now. I can't hear you. You'll need to unmute. Okay, try again. Still not hearing you.
How about now?
Now I can hear you. Okay.
Well, that was weird. All right. Well, I'm Susan Mammen, the resource conservationist at the NRCS state office in Columbia. I am in charge of, I am the CSP coordinator for the state of Missouri. My slides are going to focus on cover crops, but we have a lot of information and other practices that are available. I'm going to mention some of those through my presentation that address soil health as a whole. So next slide. We have 3 different ways that NRCS assists with any kind of conservation planning, anything that we have. You can come into the NRCS office and ask for what's called conservation technical assistance. And what that is an NRCS employee will work with you to make some decisions, you know, come up with all your resource concerns on your property and write a plan, help with designing anything that you need, any kind of technical assistance that you need. This is just basic technical assistance without financial assistance. So we wouldn't financially help you with anything, but we can provide you with all the assistance you need without that. Next slide, please. The next program we have is EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentive Program. It provides financial and technical assistance. So it looks at non-industrial forest land and also cropland, pasture land, and it helps you identify and address natural resource concerns and how to improve on those. There is a list of approximately 87 practices that are available to producers in the state of Missouri. The practices are actually listed in the program policies that are available on our website. And we call this the Fix It program. So if you have an issue that you'd like to address, our employees will come out and do a thorough assessment, come up with ideas and do brainstorming and develop a plan of what needs to be done. Then you'll apply for the EQIP program. It's not guaranteed financial assistance. You have to be ranked with all the applications with everybody else that applies for the program. And based on a series of questions that you answer, you're provided a ranking score. And we go down the list of scores until we run out of funding. We're given a set amount of funding every year for national headquarters. We don't really know until after ranking exactly what that number is going to be. Sometimes we have a general idea, but to get a definite number, you know, we have to wait for national headquarters to let us know. Next slide, please. With the conservation cover crops, it's eligible for 3 separate payments, annual payments, which means you can do it 3 consecutive years on the same acres, or up to 5 separate years if you're addressing some resource concerns related to soil health. So if you're looking at certain mixes with tillage involved, and not tillage, but reduced tillage or no till involved, then you could look at going up to 5 years of separate payments. Next slide, please. The payment rate for FY22 is $52.97 an acre for basic cover crop. For historically underserved, it's $63.57. Historically underserved looks at limited resource farmers, socially disadvantaged farmers. We have those all identified on our website, and there's a list of historically underserved categories, and you just certify if you fall under one of those categories. The second one is mechanical termination of cover crops per 1,000 square feet. And that is looking at such as urban agriculture, smaller areas with high tunnels and things like that. Next slide, please. The third program we have is the Conservation Stewardship Program. And this program falls ideally behind the EQIP program, or anytime you have taken care of or addressed issues, natural resource concerns on your land, and you've reduced soil erosion, you know, built up organic matter, those kind of things, and taking care of erosion. Then you would look at the next step is going to the Conservation Stewardship Program. So you would receive an assessment on your property based on the information you provide the planner, and then you're providing a ranking score like equip, and then we go down the list with the ranking score. Next slide, please. CSP has two different types of payments, and these are 5-year contracts. There's the annual payment, which is for maintaining the conservation level for each land use, and the activity payment. So with CSP, we look at your entire operation, everything that you're listed as operator on, and we look at farmstead, associated ag land, cropland, hayland, pasture land, and we do an assessment on each one of those land uses and see what resource concerns you meet within those land uses. And based on that information, and if you score high enough and you get selected, you would receive an annual payment. And then you have to schedule something to improve upon your contracts from your existing conservation level from the beginning. You have to choose one activity to improve upon, and that is the activity payment. Next slide, please. Activities include just using a basic cover crop practice standard. Pretty much anything you want to do. There's a few limitations and things, but everything cover crop falls under that. That payment's usually less than the other activities that we have here, but you can look at cover crop to reduce soil erosion. That's an enhancement. Intensive cover cropping to increase soil health and organic matter. So you see the list there. We have practices that are available, such as conservation crop rotation, residue management, no-till, and reduced residue management. We have what's called CPMs. That's new this year, and they are conservation plans and designs that help you address soil health. There's some that are related to soil health specifically, and you would hire somebody to write those plans for you outside of the agency. It's trying to get everybody involved, you know, the technical service providers and things, because there is we are shorthanded in trying to get things done in a timely manner. Sometimes it doesn't happen as fast as we'd like to, so we have some technical experts that assist us. Next slide, please. Payment rates for CSP, like I said, $7 per acre for a basic cover crop practice. For the enhancements, it's $862 to $1,420, just depends on which enhancement. I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but your big payment for CSP is going to come into play is looking at the actual existing conservation level that you have when you begin the contracts. That's where the biggest payment is. Next slide, please. Okay, one more thing I want to address. We have a new program coming out that is called the Environmental Quality Incentive Program Conservation Incentive Contracts. What this is a program that falls between EQIP and CSP, so it's a stepping stone. This is a program that you could sign up for and just apply to do some of the basic practices, such as conservation crop rotation, rotating your crops, residue management, no-till, minimum till, and cover crops. There is a decent payment for those. This is a new program, so I have very limited information about it right now, but as soon as we have that information, we'll be posting it to our website, the most current information that we have available. And to sign up for any of these programs, contact your local service center, and they should be able to assist you. If you have any questions or comments or anything, or would like further assistance, my contact information is here.
Great, thank you. very much, Lisa. Appreciate those comments. So at this point, we're going to go into the question and answer part of our panel, and we can go a little bit into our break. So we'll maybe take 7 or 8 minutes of questions here. And I see there's one about, is this set of policies going to be available? So each of these agencies has this information on their website. For the Department of Natural Resources, you could go into their soil and water program and find that information. Likewise with MDC, you'd look, I believe, Lisa, under the private lands area is where you'd find some of that information. Again, NRCS, these similar programs are offered in every state. One other thing to quickly mention is these are some key programs, especially in Missouri, but there are other programs available for cover crops. We're seeing a number of private companies offering programs. So one of our breakout sessions is going to get into soil carbon payments if you're interested in that. There's also a proposal pending in Congress as part of the Budget Reconciliation Act or Build Back Better Act to provide payments for cover crops through the Farm Service Agency. That would be $25 an acre for the farmer and $5 an acre for the landowner, which I believe would be the first major program for landowners to get payments. So we'll see if that one comes to pass. But with that, so let me start looking at some of these questions here. So there was a question about grazing cover crops and whether people are taking advantage of that. So Jim, I think you typed a comment in the question and answer, but I'm not sure everybody could see that. So Jim, what's been your experience in Missouri with farmers signing up to doing cover crop grazing? And then Lisa, you may also want to comment on that.
So that's one of the things we kind of struggle with, Rob, is we don't have a mechanism really to track who grazes the cover crops. Like I said, it's more of a side benefit and it's not really anything that we're tracking. So I don't have a good handle to say out of our 2,000 contracts, these are how many are actually being grazed. I think it comes down to the producers and their availability. We've had some requests of looking at watering systems and fencing. In northern Missouri, there's been a lot of structures that have been removed as far as fencing and things like that to be able to graze cover crops. So I think as producers are trying to find innovative ways to bring cattle back into the rotations, but it is something we don't track.
Okay, and then there's one from and by the way, here's the QR code if you need that for this session. So Lisa, you typed again a response in the chat, but just for those that aren't seeing the Q&A discussion, there was a question about in the Missouri Department of Conservation program for cover crops, can you convert like a fescue pasture into a native prairie? Maybe you could comment a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that is an option. When you'd be working with the planner, we might tweak the specific mix and recommendations because you wouldn't have the cattle come in to help manage those cover crops. But in terms of site prep to prepare and introduce, grass field like fescue to a native prairie, and because that fescue can be so hard to get rid of, planting it down to cover crops for a year is a great way to prep that field. So yes, that is an option.
Okay, thank you. Susan, in terms of the NRCS programs, there's a question about what does residue management mean in terms of NRCS policies?
Residue management is anytime you manage the residue on a field by limiting the amount of tillage you do or no tilling to provide better cover for the soil, more food for organisms, nutrients, and for plants, just managing that residue, plant residue that goes on top of the ground and then decomposes and goes into the soil.
Great. And then there's a two-part question for you, Susan. That new program you were mentioning at the end that NRCS will be offering, any guesses to when that will be available for sign up?
I believe it'll be within the next month that we'll be getting information out about it. Probably 15 days to 30 days.
Okay.
You should be looking for that. And I don't know how easy it is going to be to get selected. It goes through the ranking process like all of our other programs do. I don't know how many people are going to apply or, all the factors that can be involved.
And Susan, I get this question sometimes from farmers. Well, what is my chance of getting selected? So I sit on Missouri's state technical committee. It seems like in some counties, you may have better odds than in another county based on the number of people that apply. And I'm sure that would be the case nationally. Is that a kind of simple explanation?
Yes, you are correct. Based on how the money is divided up, we've started looking at zones a lot more. So we've got Ozark Highlands, Tallgrass Prairie, some different zones that we look at with CSP. And I know that they've considered looking at those zones to divide the funds up in, instead of just each county gets so much money, try to get the applications that would compete comparably together and give so much funding to each one of those, and they can compete just in their regions. So.
And Susan, I know on my own family's farm in central Illinois, one of our tenants had, I think, applied for EQIP back in about 2015 for cover crops, did not get it. And I really had to strongly encourage him to reapply because he just didn't believe he would ever get it. And I said, well, now there's more money available. And sure enough, when he reapplied, he was able to enroll in it. So would you say that's part of the story? Don't get discouraged.
That is, I recommend apply for everything you can, every chance you get, every year until you get funding, because you never know how the cards are going to fall each year, what's going to change. It may not be administered the same way every year. There's different questions we ask, and we just have no idea. So I recommend always put your name in the hat if you're interested in something, any of our practices.
And we may be seeing more money for conservation. We'll see what happens with this Budget Reconciliation Act.
Mm-hmm.
If that does come to pass as well, then there'll be more money for each of these programs, which will be helpful for those trying to sign up.
You are correct.
Well, I appreciate all of you being on to share those programs. Again, if you're outside Missouri, be thinking about programs that could be offered. One thing I found, I work some on conservation policy issues, is states like to see what other states are doing. And if you have a Department of Conservation that maybe isn't offering anything for pollinators with cover crops or wildlife with cover crops, say, hey, look over at what Missouri's doing. Or likewise, Iowa, Illinois have programs for discounts on crop insurance if you're planting a cover crop. We do not have that in Missouri. And I think more states are interested. I believe Indiana's been looking at that. So, it's always easier to copy what another state is doing if you're trying to get a new policy through, but also just see what's available in your state. You may find there's some things unique to your area. So thank you all for being on. And what we're going to do here is take a short break, and then we're going to pick up in about 7 minutes with our next speaker, which will be Dr. Kelly Wilson. She's going to talk about some of the opportunities and resources available through the Center for Regenerative